Yeah. It's July 25th, 1953. Cuba.
Please, is this enough sugar?
No.
I'm tired, sir.
And
See that? These guys have a problem with that.
well, this sucks.
Maybe we could, like, I don't know, change it or something. So they started a war to change things, and these guys finished liberating Cuba. Oh, the United States is here. And the Soviet Union. Cuba had come under American influence ever since the Spanish defeat in the Spanish-American War back in 1893.
Let's blame the Maine on Spain. So they blame the Maine on Spain.
It essentially became America's own tourist hotspot in the Caribbean, and it really sucked. See this? That's sugar, and it sells real good on the international market, so everyone wants a little bit of it. It comes from Brazil.
Lijkt er even meer.
It comes from Cuba, so when America took over Cuba, they got a big slice of that sugary, sugary pie. And economically dominate the island for decades to come, with more loyal governments being backed and funded by the US government and more nationalist ones being suppressed. The average Cuban worked in dirt poor conditions for dirt poor pay, but how could they ever wage a fight for independence against the world's largest military power? Turns out, all it takes is an Argentinian man and some good old-fashioned... Che Guevara was an Argentinian physician who traveled all throughout South America and Central America in his youth, touring the rural and poor countrysides of the continent. Despite his rich background, this experience changed him completely, and he became an adherent of Marxism, announcing his old life and becoming a fairly progressive figure, even by today's standards, which is certainly better than what the average political ideologue in Argentina gives us today. Yes, I heard you, you prepubescent ephebophile. The numbers in Argentina's economy aren't really that reflective of the actual conditions of the country.
Bananas.
Should be legalized.
Bananas.
Should be legalized. Legalize.
Bananas.
Legalize.
Bananas.
Corn. Legalize.
Bananas.
Corn. I want.
Bananas.
It's awesome. Legalize.
Bananas.
Blah 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 blah.
At the same time, a man named Fidel Castro was born in a wealthy plantation-owning family in the capital city of Havana. But after attending university, he became an avid anti-imperialist and Marxist and got himself into the same revolutionary sphere as Che Guevara did. Long story short, and I do mean a long story short, the 26th of July movement would wage a prolonged insurgency against the US-backed Batista regime for about 3 years in time, and they ended up defeating the superior Western-backed Cuban army. And although the revolutionaries were ideologically socialist, they hadn't actually planned on having a socialist country as a guarantee, but Castro was effectively elected leader as Cuba, not by a vote, but more so just by sheer numbers and popular support, and Cuba will become a one-party socialist country. Now, some of you may not know this, it's, I don't know, kind of a niche thing in history to be honest. America isn't a fan of communism. Post-revolutionary Cuba, despite, you know, everything, still had the attitude of wanting to be oons with America, even after the overthrow of the Batista regime, and hey, it was still an authoritarian government at the end of the day. America's used to dealing with those. However, to summarize the new relationship, whilst Castro was busy eating enough dairy products to look like a Sandshare character, do not look that up, the US was crashing out because they wanted their cave back, and they began taking action to do so. They really hated Castro, and they ended up plotting over 600 assassination attempts on the guy, and although they only ended up taking about 100 or so out on him, all of them failed. It's also time to remind you of this little incident right here. The communist takeover had put an end to the plantation class of Cuba, which generated a lot of people, mostly Western businessmen, settlers, and their families fleeing the island. So eventually the US shaped up about 1,000 Cuban exiles to launch an invasion of Cuba with US support to overthrow Castro. Long story short, it didn't go well. America then went on to plant an embargo on Cuba and sanction the hell out of it, leaving the entire island internationally isolated and sending it into poverty, trying to wring the Cubans out into submission and restore the Batista regime, along with the US influence. And in addition, the end of the nationalization campaigns, which had been benefiting the quality of life and the economy of Cuba before the embargo was put in. All this pressure left Cuba isolated on the world stage and in desperate need of alliance. So Castro looked east, towards Moscow, and he began an official alliance with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, who were more than happy to have a new ally right in America's backyard, and they began to strike key trade deals with the Cubans, these trades mostly being for Cuban sugar in exchange for the everyday things needed for running a country, you know, fuel, materials, and a high-grade nuclear weapon. The US and Soviets had a missile gap, and although the Soviets did have more nuclear weapons than the Americans, with hindsight, we know that these weren't exactly the best weapons in history. I mean, come on, look at the modern Russian army. We're supposed to fear these exactly. The Soviet missiles could reach Europe, yes, which despite the American perspective was much more important to the Soviets strategically than the Americans. But if the Cold War ever were to go hot, those Americans would arrive and reinforce the European front, which who knows how that could have gone. And there wouldn't be any way to strike them before they got there. But hypothetically, if there was some, I don't know, a small friendly nation state in striking distance of the entire mainland United States, we could maybe hit them. Oh, look, it's a small friendly nation state in striking distance of the entire mainland of the United States. So then they smuggled nuclear weapons onto the island. A U-2 spy plane was one day going over Cuba and snapped a photo. Oh, look, it's high-grade nuclear weaponry in America's backyard. What's wrong with that? Said President Kennedy. Well, they're in Cuba. Everybody panic! The Americans had to deal with this somehow. They could have ignored it. They could have also performed a kirking on Castro. Counting or not counting imperialist violence. And along with said assassination plans, good luck, they plan to launch a full-scale invasion of the island to overthrow Castro via direct US military force. None of these could really work though because, one, if you do nothing, congratulations, there's still nukes right next to you. And two, if you do invade, they aren't there now anymore, but they're still in Europe, and that can leave Munich, Germany looking a little something like this. On October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy announced to the U.S. public that, yes, there were missiles in Cuba, and that the U.S. would entirely blockade the island to prevent any further Soviet missiles being built up in the island stockpile. Isn't that an act of war, though? Yeah, what about it? The U.S. also began flying low reconnaissance missions over the island to gather more intelligence on the situation. And on the 27th, the shooting down of a U-2 spy plane over to Cuban airspace would occur, causing the only direct casualty of the conflict, with pilot Rudolf Anderson killed in the strike. Thing is, this had actually violated direct orders from Moscow command to, you know, not do that. Meanwhile, back in Europe, everyone was pretty concerned and feeling rather vulnerable now that the big guy with a lot of industrial output is now in direct threat. And the political consequences of such were making the West look particularly open for Soviet boots to come marching in. But thankfully, these fears were calm when Khrushchev came out and said, let me check my script here. The outright policy of the United States would lead to war with the Soviet Union and said, oh, whoops, oh, that's not good at all. And the US military raised its alertness to DEFCON 2, saying their entire military to be ready for in a matter of hours. What's DEFCON 1, you might ask? Now, what do we have here? Two nuclear superpowers with their allies right in the middle of them, both fully capable of blowing each other up. Well, now what? Neither of them are really gonna pull back, and neither of them really want everyone to die. Oops. So on October 26th, negotiations begin. Okay, we won't invade Cuba if you pull your missiles out of it.
You're lying.
Well, you would invade Europe if we pulled our missiles out of it.
Didn't deny it a award.
You didn't either! Out in the Caribbean Sea, the Soviet ships and naval assets awaited off in the waters around the American blockade area, and the Americans fired a small depth charge practice weapon at the submarine. Unaware of the slight inconvenience that this submarine had to be armed with various Soviet nuclear torpedoes, something the crew happened to be very aware of, in fact decided to launch their nuclear weaponry under the assumption that war had already broken out. Oh gosh! Except for one guy, a certain Vasily Arkhipov. Oh wow. You got anything to do after this crisis? And he decided not to fire a single missile, single-handedly preventing... Come on, do I even have to say it anymore? Since the beginning of negotiations, the general proposal the United States laid out was the removal of missiles from Cuba by the Soviets in exchange for the US pulling its missiles out of Turkey and Italy, which had the easy striking capabilities over the Soviet heartland. Kennedy himself was warm to the idea, but the feds refused at first, not wanting to give concessions to the Soviet units for a return to the status quo in the Caribbean. However, the balance of power slowly did end up shifting to the Americans. The blockade, the increased level of security, and the reinforcement of the army had left the core main open to the deal, and he had long agreed to the pull of missiles from Turkey and Italy. And finally, on the 28th, against his advisor's advice, Kennedy agreed to the deal with Khrushchev, under the condition that the Soviet pull from Cuba would be public, but the American pull would be put under the rug for now. And the Soviets began removing their missiles and their systems from the island in the following month. And by November 20th, the Cuban blockade officially ended, although the embargo does still persist today. Kennedy used the resolution to the best of his ability. He was able to give the Americans and the collective West a minor political edge over the Soviets despite the seemingly neutral outcome, which the Soviets also claimed due to the remaining existence of the communist Cuba and the removal of missiles from Turkey and Italy, while the Western and Eastern Europeans were more so just happy they didn't all, die. And the only real winner of this conflict was, I'm not kidding you, Albania, because the whole ordeal prevented the Soviets, who had just ended up falling out with the Albanian government after Enver Hoxha called everyone but him a revisionist, from invading their former ally, which they'd done plenty of times before, and the state was able to persist for the coming decades. What did this accomplish? Absolutely nothing. Absolute cinema, as usual. It is like 11:30 right now, and I still have to do the thumbnail. Tee-hee, I need an outro. Bye-bye, people. Oomphs, whatever.